priorities. We have to reform quickly. We have to turn South Africa around.
We've got a government, all parties in the government of national unity, that seem to be absolutely deaf to this problem. South Africa, we know, has its problems, and most of them lead back to the fact that under this brilliant government and economic plan that we've been running for the last 30 years, we sit with about 50% unemployment and 60% youth unemployment. We've got a government that clings on to ideas that didn't work in the 1980s, were worse in the 1990s, and are really not made for the 21st century. So, who has got answers? The logical place to go to are what are called economic think tanks, people that spend their lives creating these kind of solutions, and if only the government would listen. Well, today we've got one of those people that has been talking for a long, long time on this issue, and that is Bernstein, Executive Director of the Center for Development and Enterprise, CDE. She's an author. She writes many articles on this very point, and that is politics and business and economics. Bernstein, welcome to the State of the Nation. So good to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And you have been right at the forefront of this discussion since the advent of the new South Africa, talking about business and government. And even as recently as last year, you came out with a series of reports which would be the economic priorities for the new government. What would they be? We would like to thank Pace Car Rental for sponsoring us, and we want you to support them by hiring your next car through Pace. Go to their website, the address here below, use the code SONA, S-O-N-A, to get a discount. And now back to the show for the new government. What would they be?
Well, this is a big challenge. It's easy to criticize where South Africa is, and we're in a very desperate situation, but it's harder to actually think about where would you start? When so much is wrong, when so much is in crisis, where do you begin? So we set ourselves a challenge in January last year to say, what are the top priorities? Let's bet on a new government that we didn't know we'd get a GNU. We didn't know how it would behave. Let's bet on a better government and hope that we can influence their choice of priorities. Now, when you think of South Africa, I think the biggest challenge we face is leadership. And that is singularly lacking and has been for a long time now. I would see the last 30 years as the first 15, many achievements in the democratic era, but the last 15, 16, 17, a terrible slide. So what do? The first thing we said is you have to fix the state. So many people have lots of ideas on how to fix South Africa, and then they they tell you the state is weak and corrupt, but the next sentence they say, and the government must do this, that, and the next thing. Well, this is a contradiction. You have to accept, and it's a very hard thing to do for us as much as anyone else, that the government is not what we think it is. And you then have to say, well, what do we do in those circumstances? So the first priority, it seemed to us, was fix the state. Now, there are a lot of things you can say, and we were trying to get immediate actions for the next government, the GNU, as it turned out, to act upon. I would first and foremost have said, we no longer believe in cadre deployment, one, which has not happened. Two, we need to sort of identify mission-critical jobs. I once talking to a South African in New York, very successful, and he said, I presume President Ramaphosa has identified the mission-critical jobs as I would do in buying a business, and he's going to put the best people in the country there. So I came home and I thought about this. So what the GNU should have done, but it hasn't been able to, some parts don't want to, is they should have said, hypothetically, 120 mission-critical jobs, the top leaders in SOEs and in key departments and other agencies. We're going to have a quick and fair process to see, are you the right person for this job? Do you have the qualifications? And then how do we move the best people possible into those jobs? Because as you would tell me, unless you have the right leader at the top of a company, a department, an organization, you're not going to get anywhere. So that was a big priority, which unfortunately has not got progress.
To prove your point as to how important that is, they did it in exactly one job.
SARS.
They did.
Yes.
No, they won even better than that.
Okay.
Because, SARS we can get back to, but they did it in ESKOM, where they did go out to find the most appropriate person, best qualified, in Mteto Nyati.
Yes.
And here we sit nearly a year later without load shedding. I know that is congratulating a fish for swimming, but he was the best guy to redeem what was a terrible situation. So it does show you that you can find the right person.
And we can turn South Africa around. So I think for a lot of people, they've lost hope. There are many in the ANC, I think, which we'll come to, the few people who are serious about governance, many of them have lost hope. They don't see new ideas. They don't know what to do in many parts of the ANC, I would argue. Anyhow, so one priority was fixing the state, which not an easy thing to do. We wanted a much smaller cabinet. We had all sorts of proposals on how you could cut the cabinet. And one of the reasons for that is if you want a reforming government, you have to have a small group of people. You don't want a cabinet of 70 people or even 30 people. You want a small group of people who all agree. These are the top priorities. We have to reform quickly. We have to turn South Africa around. So that was our thinking, which we didn't get. And so that was one big area. I could go into more detail. A second big area is the rule of law. We won't get investment and the kind of growth that we need and the sort of society we want unless we ensure the foundations of the rule of law. Now, if you think about we picked two areas. We looked at catalytic areas in each of our themes. If you take two, we chose to focus on the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, which whatever other work it's done, has struggled to successfully prosecute any of the key actors in named in the Zondo Commission and get them into jail if found guilty. And there are other big corruption cases. So the NPA was one area of focus, and the second was the Judicial Service Commission, which has been, until hopefully this year, a disaster, really, where prominent lawyers, the people we would want to be judges and on the Constitutional Court, stopped putting themselves forward because of the appalling way in which they were being interviewed. So we chose those two. You could choose many more, the police and so on. So we said the rule of law was critical. The third thing we said was the fiscal crisis, which everyone wants to ignore, but is real. And as we get less and less growth, our debt becomes a bigger percentage of our GDP. And this, as your listeners will know, affects our prospects for growth. So that was our third area. The fourth area was, in the context of a state that doesn't work, there are pockets of some excellence still. And you've mentioned one. I'm a big fan of Mteto Nyati. And the Reserve Bank and other places, but these are few and far between. You have to say, how do we open up to markets, which are not perfect, but the part of our society that still works is what's left of our business sector and its dynamism. And you've got to make sure that's as competitive as possible and open up space for markets and businesses to provide services where the state can't and perform functions that the state can't. And then the last priority we chose was a sort of inelegant language, but it's how do we get mass employment and much greater inclusion. And that's about many things. And we're about to release a document on how to take unemployment seriously. And I'm happy to talk a lot about that, because I think the way in which the country's approaching some 12.5 million people who would like to work but cannot find a job in a much more serious way. I don't think we're tackling this seriously enough from the president downwards, and business, actually. And then we've also looked a lot at how do we promote a much more dynamic small business sector. So I'm happy to talk about any of these issues in terms of what, let's call it, the ANC part of the government has not done, and in my view fails to fully appreciate how you have to change. The most important issue, I would say, is that to think we can continue with the same policies that have got us into this mess is the fundamental error. And it's not just tweaking them. You have to say, why are we in such a mess? We need a diagnosis. When I go to the doctor, he has to say, this is what's wrong with you, and then he gives you a cure. But South Africans, the president, the ANC has not said, we are in this mess, a terrible mess, because of A, B, C, and D. We duck this issue. And so we never get to a real diagnosis, and therefore we think tweaking or the same or doubling down on something that's failing is going to help turn South Africa around.
Well, and let's start off with some of the points, and so that we don't dwell on what doesn't even help us talking about, and that is that the government is clearly, and the ANC part of the government, as you put it, is clearly determined to just protect what it has managed to steal, right? And I use that term not just in the monetary terms, but they've stolen positions, they've stolen influence. So they're not going to change that. I think we can say that with some certainty, because we know what President Ramaphosa has done since the election, which is absolutely no improvement on these particular issues, right? We know.
Well, I would be a bit more nuanced. I think that moving towards privatization, let's call it, with respect to ports and rail, and opening up energy production have been some of the most important things that have happened. It's been much too slow, in my view, and we're not yet created a competitive market even in energy, where we've gone the furthest, and we should be much further down the line in terms of ports, rail, and so on. But through necessity, not through conviction. There's been some...
That's why I challenge that as some kind of achievement, because it wasn't done by design. It was done because you couldn't run the ports, because you couldn't run the power grid. Because you can't run the police force, therefore you end up with a preponderance of security companies. These aren't achievements. These are outcomes of your own bad work. So I don't feel the need to be nuanced at all, right? Because let's call it what it is. These situations that look like triumphs exist because of government failure, not because of government success. This isn't some part of the government plan. Obviously, all I can say on politics is, as somebody that is a commentator, to how disappointed and saddened are you by the performance of the other parties in the government of national unity, right? Because you can't blame the ANC for being the ANC. We knew what we're getting. They're not about to change. We know that. There's 30 years where you and I have been hearing renewal, and there's no renewal, where they say justice and this and that and repercussions, and there's nothing. So eventually one gets the message, this dinosaur ain't going to change. But a lot of parties went into their government of national unity saying exactly what you said: smaller government, we're bloated cabinet, we're not going to abide by this, abide by that, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, we're going to draw a red line, and then we just march over the red line. This is Sudeten land all over again, right? Where, it must be a real source of disappointment to watch parties that say one thing and then do another. I give the ANC a free pass on this, because They have never lied. They never intended to change. But to see a party like the DA say we're going to do this and do this and do that, and then they don't, to me is way more disappointing than watching the ANC being the ANC. I don't know about you.
Well, Mike, I have a different view. I think that without being naive, there have been some steps by, let's call it, the current government and previous ANC government. I am a supporter of Operation Vulindlela. I think that has been an important initiative. Yes, it does tell you the rest of the government doesn't work well, but there are some very serious reformers in Operation Vulindlela that are trying their best to move things along. So that's one point I'd make. The second is the hope of the GNU was that we could get the beginnings of, if you like, building the center of South African politics. People committed to the Constitution and market economics in one form or another. And that by doing that, we would have a much better chance of dealing with our poly-crisis on all fronts. I think what's happened is that, I'm going to leave out the small part, the tiny, tiny parties. I think they're pretty uninteresting. And they were used as a camouflage and diminished the importance of the DA in the GNU. I have been disappointed in some respects. On the other hand, I was talking with the Minister of Home Affairs just yesterday, who I think has been a fantastic minister and is really making progress, which is great. And there are one or two others that are doing the same. But if you think of the government as a whole, what's happened is that the ANC has kept foreign policy to itself, and it's been disastrous for the country. They've kept how we deal with in the fundamentals, trade, and
they've kept economic policy to themselves.
Economic policy. And there's been, surprisingly to me, absolutely no reform of economic policy as we stagnate for the 15th or 16th year. So, yes, the GNU has been disappointing. I was mildly hopeful that we might get a bit more than we have. And I think the truth is that it's very difficult. Coalition politics is hard. This isn't a real coalition. I think that's the truth of it. We have two parties who really don't get on. They don't talk to each other nearly enough.
Or at all.
All the promises of the statement of intent, which has hopeful sort of potential, you might say, have not been fulfilled, from a proper dispute mechanism to actually developing a common program of action. We sit here over a year later and there's no common program of action. We have endless reports that unfortunately I have to read, from the new industrial policy to the medium-term development plan, which are just business as usual for the ANC. So the GNU has been an enormous disappointment. On the other hand, there were worse alternatives, and they would have been very bad for the country.
Yeah, you see, this is where I'm going to disagree with you. I would say that South Africa, where it is right now, sometimes, there was this wonderful statement, this thing in Afrikaans, this phrase, as jy nie wil luister nie, dan moet jy voel. If you don't want to listen, you're going to have to feel it. And I think the time has come for South Africa to feel what it feels like. So in many ways, this whole doomsday coalition, I would be almost anarchist about it, to say, bring it on, let the country go down. We've lived through Zuma before, and if that's the threat that you want to throw at us, then let's live through it again. Just to sober people up, because we need some sobering up in this country. There is no doubt. And look, that's my view, and I can say that because it's not happening. It would maybe be different if it was happening. But let's set aside politics, because, clearly our solutions aren't going to come from our politicians. They have no interest in making the country a better place.
No, I'm not going to agree with you on that. I think there are some politicians who are very seriously committed to fixing South Africa.
Can you name one?
You only have to look at the Cape Town City Metro and the Western Cape to say, here are people who've made a real difference.
Do they want?
We know the data is there. The evidence is there. Unemployment is much lower than the national unemployment rate or other metros.
But that doesn't come through great planning. That says when we are more efficient, everybody else will organize themselves.
So I'm not going to throw politicians out the window. And I think there is hope of better politicians taking power, perhaps in the metros after next year's local government elections. We also need to talk about the voters. I think voters, and you and I probably agree on this, I think that at a certain point, the voters get what they vote for. And unless they understand that you have to throw out this bunch of rascals and try another bunch of rascals and see if they do better, South Africa's going to be in trouble. And that's starting to happen.
Yeah. The sad fact of the matter is that they did that at the last election and we end up with the same bunch of rascals. Let's talk about the role of business. You are very kind to Operation Vulindlela. I am not. I think that this is South Africa at its worst, and that is the complicity of business with illegitimate governments. We saw it through apartheid, where our business sector propped up the apartheid government. And we are seeing it again through Operation Vulindlela, and I've had people here that were associated with it, right? We spoke about this before we started, where business in South Africa has never met a government they didn't like. And here they are bailing out government once again and selling it to South African citizens as if it wasn't for us. Do you know how bad it would be? Well, surely if you've got the power to do that, you've got the power to hold government to account. After all, you're generating a massive amount of taxes. You've got great influence, far more influence than you and I have, right? The CEO of a big bank or a big mine or mining group or whatever. It's got great influence. They just choose not to use it. And now they prop up the ANC government by making stuff work. Right? They did it before the election. It didn't help. They're doing it again. What do you think the role of business, should it be this compliant to a government that has got no interest in improving the economy or improving the life of South Africans? Do you think business should be complicit in that?
I think business's role in a society is quite complex. So on the one hand, the enormous strength of businesses is that they can operate and make profits and survive as companies in many different political environments. Now, the complex questions that individual companies have to deal with in non-democratic states, but let's not go there. I think that South African business, and this is a much more complex category. It's a whole lot of individuals, you know well, a lot of egos, lots of competition within South African business. And then there's big business, there's medium, there's small business, there's informal business. So this is a big category. When I think about large companies in South Africa, I'm not happy with some of the things that they've done. I think that at the start of the Ramaphosa era, on the one hand, you could see they were desperate for anything post-Zuma. They misread him. They misread the president. They thought, well, because he sits on our boards and he seems like a sensible man, we know him. And what they did was they ignored the political side of the president, who has been in the ANC for decades and decades, who's been a very important person in the ANC, who was chairman of the deployment committee during the Zuma years. Think about that for a moment. They ignored all of that to say, we know this man. And I went around talking to a lot of businessmen at the time, and they all said, you know, I have his phone number. And I was saying, well, what are you going to say to him? But we didn't get that far. So I think since the President Ramaphosa's sort of administrations, corporate business decided they were going to support him in all sorts of ways. And my point would be that the role of business in a society is to do many things. Firstly, to run your companies properly and make profits and survive and do all the great things that good companies do. But they ignored the public side of a democracy, and they weren't very effective in the public square. And I think their single biggest failure has been to not even try to sell the benefits of markets, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, to ordinary South Africans. There is a story to tell of the phenomenal benefits we have from having large companies, which are very unusual in many respects to other developing countries of our size. They've failed to even try to market the good of business. And they got, to my mind, many of them, not all, became very quiet about what was happening in the country and got too close to how do we prop up this president. And I think that a number of mistakes have been made. Now, when 2 years ago or so, a number of prominent individuals in business said, we're going to help the president, I don't know why they had to affirm their patriotism to the country as the government is destroying the country, but that's a different matter. It's very hard to say you shouldn't get involved in helping to get the electricity on. I wouldn't say that. So anything you can do, good. But that isn't all you should do. You should be speaking out at the same time on a fundamental change in policy, on a terrible foreign policy, on all the fundamentals. So yes, you can help behind the scenes, but you shouldn't be co-opted. And there's a difference between, if you like, cooperating on a particular project to help South Africa and, in a sense, propping up, being a band-aid to a failing government. Yeah. And I think that's a hard set of choices, but in general, I'm not happy with where the majority of big companies have landed up.
Yeah, I see it. I see it that those businesses are just an extension of government. I see them. You say that we've got a unique situation. That unique situation is the outrageous size of our big companies compared to the size of the rest of the economy. And they get that by being able to write the laws that keep out their potential competitors, right? So it suits them to go very close to a government that's out of their depth when it comes to business, so that they can write the exclusionary laws that keep out potential competition. We saw that in cell phones, we see that in banking, we see that in data, we see that in a whole stream of things. You know, I've always said that nothing suits big companies more than the most stringent BEE rules, because they can comply, they can get an army of lawyers, they can get 50 MBAs because they can pay above market rates. A small company can't do it. So it immediately eradicates competition from that big company. And these guys sit there on big share options, and they know that the one thing that they mustn't do is antagonize the ANC, because they're in on the grift. That's all I see when I see big business. I'd see big business being too scared, for example, to advertise on State of the Nation, but they'll go and advertise on SABC. You know, you understand what I mean? It's that kind of corporate cowardice that I find, at least when you look at the corporate greed that happens in the first world, in America, where big corporates, and we saw it with the tech bros, suddenly supporting Donald Trump. They're doing it in their own interests. They're doing it so they can, and they are doing exactly what we're doing here. They're just doing it in a more open fashion. We want to keep everybody else out.
There's some parts of this I agree with, and some I don't.
Please.
So take labor law. I am very angry with big business, who supported a long time ago and has failed to shout and scream about the way in which our labor laws, for example, collective bargaining agreements, where you and I'm the union and you're the big company, we do a deal. That's fine. We can agree on whatever, conditions, wages, hours, and so on. But then the minister extends that to everybody, all companies who weren't at the negotiating table. Now, I'm totally opposed to that, and it clearly harms our small business sector and new businesses. and rural businesses and everyone who wasn't around that table. And I don't think big business has been sufficiently determined to, at the same time telling us they want small businesses, they've gone along with those things and it sometimes have been complicit. So on labor law and the other examples, I think you're right. I want a competitive market economy. We have a competition commission and the government has said they're really committed to competition. The problem is they've allowed the core essence of competition policy, which you're talking about, to kind of be sidelined while they try to push through BEE recommendations and transformation recommendations or localization recommendations, all of which I think have harmed the economy. So should South Africa be a much more competitive economy? Absolutely. Some of the chatter about this is just divorced from reality. Let me give you an example. There's a very senior person in the ANC, very close to the president for many, many years, who sat in our offices telling me how there's no competition among the banks. And I should say there are only 4 banks. And I'd say, no, actually, there's Capitec, which has shown.
Yeah, it's now the biggest bank. Yeah.
Exactly. They came from below. They're a new bank, essentially. And now there are all these other banks, from Time to whatever, tons and tons of banks. How can you say there's no competition? But she was wedded to there is no competition, whatever facts you put on the table.
It's an old trope, isn't it?
It's an old trope. So I'm with you on some areas. There's insufficient competition. And I want to say, why hasn't the Competition Commission dealt with this quickly, efficiently, fairly? There are other areas where there's enormous competition, and that's great for consumers. So again, you and I I'm the more nuanced person, more sort of influenced by the evidence as we would see it from CDA. But are we a successful economy? No, we're a failing economy. We're a slipping sort of upper middle income society, and that's absolutely terrible. And I don't think there's sufficient appreciation among most South Africans that how bad things are. You know, poverty, the president lectures the country on how well they've done, and we brought water and electricity and all sorts of things to poorer South Africans. And they certainly did that in the first 15 years, more or less. But now the number of people living in poverty is growing. It's absolutely stunning when you think that it's, depending how you define it, around sort of 55 to 60% of South Africans. This is failure. So I think I come back to where we started. What's really important for those of us who committed to the country and worried about the country, and rightly so, we've got to sort of choose priorities. We've got to focus on the right issues. And growth is absolutely issue number one. And how do you get there? We need some leadership, some changes, proper reforms with speed. We also need a much more labor-absorbing economy. So if we can get growth, we want labor-absorptive growth wherever we can. So you've got to have the top end of the economy, which is catching up. As you and I were talking about, we're falling behind compared to other countries. We need the sort of frontier part of our economy, high tech, high skill, high wage. But we've got to think about where the majority of the workforce are, where through no fault of their own, they haven't had work experience, they've come out of terrible schools, and probably families and communities where very few people work. What kind of jobs are we offering them? Now, the government has said, and people have gone along with this, some of our business friends as well, that, you know, we need high-skill, high-wage jobs, decent jobs for everyone in South Africa. You know, the former president of Mexico put it really well. He said, people think there's a choice, high-skilled jobs or no low-skilled jobs. Actually, it's low-skilled jobs for the vast majority of people initially, or no jobs at all. And we are the world's best example of that terrible situation. Yeah. So I want lots more labor-intensive manufacturing and all sorts of things that deal with the workforce we actually have, at the same time as fixing our skills and education system.
The terrifying thing might be that it might be too late for low-skilled jobs. It might be too late, and the reason that I say that is that if one looks at Asia, that does a lot of what we would have called low-skilled jobs, factory work, etc., right. They are becoming people that can use technology, because those jobs aren't about people sitting there sewing things. These are people managing big machines that are sewing things.
Not yet. So we've done a lot of work on this, and we've talked to a lot of world experts on what's happening in Asia and the advance of technology in these very, making a T-shirt. And it's not there yet. It's actually harder to do than it seems. So we have a window. Let's call it 10 years, nobody really knows, where we could get low-skilled jobs in those very basic consumer goods and try and get into world markets. And we've actually we've proposed a practical idea to take Kuche, which is one of the government's special economic zones, which isn't. It's mainly felt at the moment. And we're saying, you've invested the money already. Let us try and let business lead on this. Let the private sector lead on this. Let's see if we could attract some factories from Asia and elsewhere to come and set up here, maybe some domestic capital as well. And let's get expertise on how we get into the global market for very low. We couldn't be the lowest of the low. We can't compete with Bangladesh, but we can compete with the Philippines and various other countries. Keep the minimum wage, but allow factories to do all other negotiations on whatever suits them. So we are putting forward an idea which we've tested with world experts, South African experts, which we think is worth a shot. Can't guarantee it, but it's worth a shot. And there is, 20 years ago, if we had said Bangladesh can turn from being this unbelievably poor place to a center of low-skill manufactured goods, of assembly of toys, and now assembly of technological goods, we would have been laughed out of court. But they did it. And if so we're saying there's a window still, and we should try and get as many jobs as we can. But we're not even trying.
Yeah. Do you think there's an opportunity? How's this for a weird idea? Do you think there's an opportunity that we try that model, but in neighboring countries? So in other words,
we did it in Lesotho.
Yeah, but it's hardly
that were in South Africa moved to Lesotho for a go and all sorts of things. I think we've got to.
It's a small extension of South Africa. I mean, one wonders, because we've got a government, all parties in the government of national unity, that seem to be absolutely deaf to this problem. Do you not think that there's a chance to convince, for example, God forbid, Zimbabwe, that seems to be more open to trade than South Africa, for us to start exporting these kind of things so that we can export our labor? I mean, it's not ridiculous.
We're never going to export South Africans who live here. I'm not in favor. I certainly don't advocate that. There are parts of South Africa where we have some people with experience of industrial sort of type jobs. So we're much better off than Ethiopia in that sense. They're like a century behind us, and people aren't disciplined into the nature of work. But if you take the Eastern Cape, for example, it's got a terribly high unemployment rate. And you could see a situation where we could do something there. And we're saying, give us some space to do that. Leave the rest of the country. This is what China did. When at a certain point, Deng said, well, I can't persuade everyone to attend multinational capital, but let me do it around Shanghai. And they slowly did it, and it was incredibly successful, and then everyone else wanted to do it. And we're saying we're similarly stuck in this country around, let's call it freeing up labor markets. Give us some space for an experiment. It might not work, but we think it has a good chance if you gave us space to have an enclave. That really is special.
So
I'm much more in favor of that. I'm not in favor of exporting South African workers elsewhere.
But then to go back to one of the points you said earlier, then if we've got such a wonderful thing going in the Western Cape, why wouldn't that government want to do that? Why wouldn't the Western Cape want to be that enclave? Instead, they seem to be building their own wall to try and keep people out. Why wouldn't they be the enclave rather than, this sort of Airbnb destination?
Well, they're more than that. They're going for a different market. And it's a good question. Okay, I take the question. I think there is some support in the DA for this kind of an idea. We've tried to sell it in Port Elizabeth and that region and got some positive response. A lot of people just think, oh, government will never do it. I was hopeful that maybe the GNU could be persuaded to give us some space, and we haven't given up yet. But it would be different in the Western Cape. They do have low-skilled people. To fix the port, you've got underutilized port capacity in PE, 2 ports that are underutilized. It would be different, but your question is absolutely valid. Why is nobody interested in doing it there? And I think they've decided their other sort of priorities. But I would be in favor of, I would try it in the Eastern Cape next to a port, or in the Durban port is another possibility, if it worked.
Yeah.
So you've got to be close to get your goods out.
Goods out, yeah.
But a fair question.
And of course, we've got to say that the one thing that keeps the lights on is our lack of economic growth.
Right. I agree with you.
Because if we had 1% more of economic growth, the lights would go off.
Well, at the moment, as you know, in Johannesburg, nationally, we might have got rid of load shedding, although we're spending a lot of money in diesel, if you've noticed. But in Johannesburg, we have what's delightfully called load reduction. Yeah. And my neighborhood has had it for the last 2 weeks, on and off. So we're not over the energy crisis, in my view. And we have been very slow in both getting the kind of all the reforms in energy that we need to get more effective distribution system, to separate ESKOM from controlling everything, to get a market. What we need is a market for power. And there are examples of countries which were similarly in crisis that have gone the market sort of competition route, where actually energy is, at certain times of the day, your energy is sort of zero cost. Now, South Africa's nowhere near that, because even though I've been positive about some of the things that have happened, they're not speedy enough, and they're not done with like night and day. We're going to get this done as fast as possible. Yeah. They sort of drag on forever, and then we hear that all these court cases affecting energy, and where's ESKOM, and at no point, and this is why I come back to my first point, which is leadership. I'm a reasonably informed citizen. I don't feel the president has stood up and either told us why we're in the mess we're in, or in just an area like energy or logistics. This is why we're in this mess. This is the game plan, and these are my targets, my deadlines. In 6 months we'll be here, in another 6 months we'll be here, and if we're not, I'll fire people. You never hear anything like that.
Don't worry, he's going to get all of his answers out of his national dialogue, because then he'll hear why we don't have tablets in our clinics. I think he should speak to his health minister. And there is one plan that came out, and I know you did have something to say on it, and it is 100 billion rand transformation fund.
Yes, we're opposed to this. We think, look, at one level, transformation is the national project. We want a society where the color of your skin does not affect your opportunities. That is what South Africa, democratic South Africa, should be all about. I'm committed to that, and I would like more people to talk more about this, particularly white South Africans. So I'm committed to that. What we called our document on the transformation fund, we said right goal, wrong tool, wrong mechanism. I think you've got to think hard about what have we achieved in the last 30 years? And it's not nothing. I'm not in that school. It would be ridiculous to say that. When you walk around Johannesburg, in corporate South Africa, there are people, we're a different place in terms of race. But in a country with sort of, I would say 43% unemployment, 60% poverty, you can't talk of transformation at all. So why are we failing? And I'm in favor of a serious look at what went wrong, what's good about where we are, and there are some things, potentially. We have got some role models, Black South Africans, real business people, but not nearly enough, in my view. So what's gone well? What's harming the country? And what could we do much better? So I'm very interested in, obviously for me, a key tool of empowerment is a job. You can get a second chance if you get a job, even a menial job. On a factory floor, you're learning about discipline, you're watching other people and thinking, I want that person's job. How do I do it? There are all sorts of things you learn. So a job is absolutely critical, but there's much more. That's not we've got to fix our skills system. We've got to fix our education. It's appalling that we're one of the worst performers in the world at very high cost in our schools. Now, if you really cared about transformation, this would be a much higher priority. There are lots of issues. So we're actually commencing at CDE a sort of very serious look at what have we achieved, what's going wrong, what could you do differently, what would be a better approach to getting the kind of society we want where millions and millions of Black South Africans who were discriminated against in the past in so many ways, their parents from accumulating capital or running a small business to going to terrible schools, etc., etc. What do we do about this if we're serious? So I'm interested in getting beyond the slogans and trying to seriously say, here is an alternative way of thinking about what is the biggest challenge that we face that is not an obstacle to growth and jobs, but accelerates growth and jobs.
Yeah, and how sad it is that one of the cornerstones of apartheid was to deny Black South Africans property ownership, the opportunity to create generational wealth. And now the ANC have followed the National Party in passing legislation that denies property ownership and building generational wealth. And this is going to come back to hurt South Africa many years after Anne and I will have departed this place. But people don't understand what a bad decision it was to undermine property rights the way that they've been undermined, to undermine the ability for anybody to build generational wealth, as some really bad legislation has been passed. And boy, it's going to hurt this country, not just until Donald Trump is gone. Believe me, it's a bad idea. It was tried under apartheid. And the fact is that it worked under apartheid. You denied Black South Africans the opportunity to build wealth. It's being replayed again. It's very sad and it's very damaging to the country. And please, God, somebody in government understands just what some of the implication of some of their bad decisions. And it's been great speaking to you. It's really wonderful that people should know the work of organizations like the Center for Development and Enterprise, the CDE. Read what you write, understand that it's coming from a position of wanting the country to be the best it can be, which we are not doing at the moment. Anne Bernstein, thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation.
Thank you.
To everybody that watched us today, I hope you enjoyed this. Please subscribe to the State of the Nation, and we'll see you again soon. Every business needs a world-class video to show to your clients and prospective clients. When the StreamIn team isn't filming the State of the Nation, they are producing those world-class videos for